Thank you for joining us today for our webinar hosted by the Jewish Democratic Council of America. The UAE Agreement, Israel, and the Jewish Vote is the title. My name is Ron Klein, and I'm chair of JDCA. I'm thrilled to be joined today by former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, Dana Stroul, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and our Executive Director, Haley Seufer. With less than 50 days before the most important election of our lives, JDCA is mobilizing voters from around the country to elect Joe Biden, win back the Senate, and increase our House majority. Our work has never been more important. While President Trump continues to threaten our democracy and fail to lead our country through this terrible COVID-19 crisis, Joe Biden is leading not only in the polls, but in empathy, strength, and his clear ability to unify our nation. This kind of leadership exactly is what JDCA has been requesting and calling for the last 4 years, and is one of the many reasons we are proud to stand with Joe Biden. In fact, recent polling from the nonpartisan Jewish Electoral Institute, which we'll discuss further, shows that Biden has a 40-point lead in the Jewish community over Trump when it comes to approval on a number of issues, and that Republican attempts to win the Jewish vote have not moved the needle at all in Donald Trump's numbers with Jewish voters. They're exactly as they were in February, regardless of all attempts otherwise. Joe Biden is a true mensch in the way we know a mensch. He will continue to be a true friend of the Jewish community when we elect him in November. Biden's strong support for Israel has spanned his entire 5-decade career in public life, the longest pro-Israel record of any candidate ever to run for president. Last month, JDCA welcomed the announcement of the agreement of diplomatic relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and today we also welcome the opening of talks between Israel and Bahrain. We were relieved to see President Trump, at least temporarily, take unilateral Israeli annexation of the West Bank off the table, but he should have never put it and endorsed it in the first place. But there are still unanswered questions, which we're going to talk about today, including whether the U.S. will provide F-35s to the UAE, which could erode Israel's qualitative military advantage. We remain deeply concerned about the Trump administration's attempt to take credit for agreements that have been in place and in the direction for many years, but that the greatest threats to Israel, including the potential for a nuclear-armed Iran and the failure to achieve a two-state solution, have not increased but decreased under President Trump. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Ambassador Shapiro and Ms. Stroul to discuss these issues and others regarding the UAE agreement, Israel, and the Jewish vote. Dan Shapiro served as our ambassador to Israel under President Obama, where he helped shape U.S. policy related to Israel, including our strong and unwavering security and military relationship. Dan helped to negotiate and finalize the unprecedented $38 billion 10-year Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Israel signed by President Obama in 2016. Dana Stroul is the Shelley and Michael Kasson Fellow at the Washington Institute's Beth and David Goodall Program on Arab Politics. She previously served for 5 years as a senior professional member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she covered the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. Moderating our conversation today and here to share information on the recent poll of Jewish voters is JDCA Executive Director Haley Seufer. Prior to her work for JDCA, Haley worked as a senior policy advisor in the Obama administration and for several members of Congress, and most recently as a national security advisor by our vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. You can submit your questions to the panel by emailing info@jewishdem's.org or posting them in the Zoom chat on your screen. We invite you to join the conversation on Twitter by tweeting us at US Jewish Dems and using the hashtag JewishDemsInAction. And don't forget to check us out at www.jewishdem's.org, our website, to see how you can get involved in helping win this election. Now I'm going to turn it over to Haley Seufer, our Executive Director. Haley?
Thank you, Ron, and thanks to Dan and Dana for joining us today to discuss the agreement signed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Israel and Bahrain. While JDCA welcomes the normalization of relations between these three countries, we also hope that when the details of the agreements are publicly released, they will live up to their promise. At the same time, today's ceremony does not make one of the most divisive and reckless presidents in US history a peacemaker, nor does it answer substantial questions about these agreements, including the sale of advanced weapons to the United Arab Emirates that may threaten Israel's qualitative military edge, which is something we will look at today. One thing that was not mentioned at all in today's ceremony was the fact that Israelis and Palestinians are further today from achieving a two-state solution, and Iran is closer to acquiring a nuclear weapon than it was 4 years ago. To the extent Donald Trump may have been using this agreement to score political points with Jewish voters, it's not working. Perhaps that's why Donald Trump conceded a few weeks ago that he moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem for the evangelicals. Recent polling, as mentioned, demonstrates that nothing President Trump has done, including signing this agreement, has increased his support among Jewish voters. Since February, Donald Trump's numbers among Jewish voters have not gone up, while Joe Biden's favorability with Jewish voters has increased by 10 points, from 60 to 70% from February to September. Interestingly, while 88% of Jewish voters self-identify as pro-Israel, and importantly, this is exactly an even amount among Jewish Democrats and Jewish Republicans, Jewish voters prioritize domestic policy issues over Israel when asked which issues are most important. Less than 1/5 of respondents said that Israel is one of the most important issues when deciding which candidate to support. For these reasons and more, the Israel-UAE agreement will likely have no effect on Jewish voters' view of Donald Trump, but Jewish voters do trust Joe Biden more than Donald Trump on Israel. All that said, it's important to better understand this agreement and what it means for the United States and Israel. So over to our panelists, Dan and Dana. What is your view of today's signing ceremony and the significance of this agreement, the agreements between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain? And as follow-up, could you give us a sense of just how long the negotiations have been underway and what are the domestic political implications here and in Israel? And Dan, we'll start with you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Ron and Haley and everyone at JDCA for hosting me. And it's great to be with my friend and colleague, Dana. To talk about the signing ceremony, the significance, I don't think we should try to underestimate the significance. I'm in Israel, and I would say across the board in Israel, these are seen as very positive developments. Of course, Israel has only had 2 peace treaties signed with Arab neighbors previously, Egypt and Jordan. So these are third and fourth, and they are the first of the Gulf states to formally normalize relations. Some question about whether they fall into categories of peace treaties or peace agreements with countries that Israel's never really been at war with. So it doesn't have exactly the same resonance as the end of the state of war with Egypt and the end of the state of war with Jordan, where Israelis fought and died to defend their country. But certainly many Israelis are excited and pleased, and it speaks both to their desire to be accepted as a neighbor in good standing in the Middle East, and the benefits that can derive from it, not just security cooperation, that's already been ongoing, but new areas of cooperation in academia, in trade, and tourism, and technology, particularly in the UAE, where there's a very significant private sector as well. So there are a lot of opportunities that are seen there, and I think this is why Vice President Biden, when the UAE agreement was announced on August 13th, absolutely welcomed it. And that should be the reaction of anybody who cares for Israel's security and peace with its neighbors, because it really has been a long-term strategic objective of bipartisan administrations going back many years. The truth is the UAE in particular, and Bahrain as well, have had quiet and active relations with Israel for many years. In fact, the original times when they were in touch even somewhat publicly was during the Oslo period, when Israel actually opened offices in several of the Gulf states. After the Oslo Accord sort of ran aground, those offices were closed, but it was still there was still a very active and vibrant private dialogue between these countries, particularly in the security sector. And it was something that in the Obama-Biden administration, we worked to promote and nurture. We helped actually Israel and the UAE overcome a very significant bump in their relations and restore relations that had sort of gotten frozen after a security incident in 2010 when a Hamas operative was assassinated in Dubai. And then it was the Obama-Biden administration, and particularly Vice President Biden himself, who was very active in conditioning American support for the UAE to host an international organization called the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi on permitting an Israeli delegation to operate openly in Abu Dhabi. And so that delegation has been there since 2015, conducting diplomacy as an Israeli government entity, very much because of U.S. efforts. So this has been a trajectory over many, many years, something that has been supported and tried to be advanced by many administrations and many members of Congress. And so to that extent, it's obviously something that it's nice to see it reach that fruition of formal relations, which will be followed by embassies and fully developed trade relations and so forth. And these could be warmer pieces than the Egyptian and Jordanian ones. There seems to be less, there's some domestic opposition in Bahrain, seems to be not much that is being heard anyway in the UAE, but it seems likely that it can be of a different character than the Jordanian and Egyptian agreements, which are fairly cold at the people-to-people level and mostly at the government and security service level. I'm sure President Trump is very happy that this happened. It sort of fell into his lap several weeks before the election. The truth was, we were on a trajectory for, as Ron mentioned, a really terrible idea that was advanced by the Trump administration to be enacted, and that was unilateral Israeli annexation of the West Bank, which was really in the cards after the Trump plan was issued in January. And what happened was in June, the UAE ambassador in Washington, who probably a lot of people here know, Yusuf El-Otaiba, published an article in Hebrew in an Israeli newspaper where he said, you know what, the UAE is really ready to take its next step in its negotiations, in its relations with Israel, but it's either normalization or annexation. Those two cannot coexist. And so Israelis will simply have to choose. Now, fortunately, the right choice was made. But this was, in effect, kind of giving the Israelis and perhaps Trump himself an off-ramp from a terrible trajectory that they were on, and ended in a good place by, as I said, culminating something that we've all sought to have achieved for a long time. And in so doing, protecting the two-state solution from really being buried if annexation had actually occurred. Burying annexation is a much better outcome. Final sentence is just to say, I agree very much with the findings of the poll. Nobody I would think, would expect that this event, as positive as it is going to have a significant impact on the election, whether in the Jewish community or beyond the Jewish community on November 3rd. I think we all know what this election is about. Primarily, it's about the disastrous handling of the COVID pandemic. It's about our economic crisis. It's about the reckoning of racial justice, needs for racial justice. And it's about the decline of American respect and leadership with our allies in Europe and in Asia, and as we face the rising challenges of China and Russia. This was a good day, but I don't think anybody should have any illusions about its broader significance in American politics.
Thank you. Dana?
Thanks so much, Haley, and thank you to JDCA. I just want to say, first of all, having come from the Hill a couple years ago, but serving on the Hill during the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, what was so clear to me before the Trump administration is that I did not have to spend time talking about rising anti-Semitism globally or domestically. These were not issues that constituents and different groups that I interacted with wanted to discuss. And so when I look at the work that JDCA is doing about what Jewish voters care about, and that it's not just Israel, to me, how I was raised on social justice and what Jewish Americans in particular stand for. I'm just so pleased to be part of this event today because it's such important work, and that poll really speaks to at least how I was raised in my Jewish home. So just to build on what Dan said, I agree with everything that he said. And I just want to share one story with all of you, which is last year, so 2019, way before the current crisis about is annexation going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Before the Trump Vision to Peace was released, before the Bahrain Economic Conference, and before the Emirati ambassador to Washington, Yusuf Otaiba, published the op-ed in an Israeli publication in Hebrew saying it's normalization with us or annexation, but you can't have both. So before all of these things, I had a delightful lunch with an old friend who works in the Israeli government last year, who was part of a team that was traveling regularly to Gulf capitals. And what that friend said to me at the time is, it's just such a fresh, different kind of interaction than what we have with Egyptians and Jordanians. You don't have that historical baggage. You don't have the absence, the cold peace, or the absence of a desire for people-to-people ties. You have a willingness to discuss what the economic potential, what is the trade potential, what's the entrepreneurship, exchange, and partnership potential, where's the tech potential. All of these are things that people want to discuss with us when we go to these capitals. It's fresh, it's energizing. I love going. This was last year. So to me, what this tells us is that these relationships have been developing for a long time, and very much because it's been encouraged not just by the Trump administration, but long before, which means that administrations, particularly the Obama administration, was putting these points in its diplomatic talking points, in its engagement, every single interaction, long before Trump came to the White House. And part of that, the driver, was a strategic convergence of the threat perception between many countries, particularly in the Arab Gulf and Israel, that the main driver of instability in the region is Iran. And on that foundation of intelligence and security cooperation, the conversation and discussion could then be expanded into the economic space, into the trade space, into all these other spaces that are now being talked about with excitement and so openly. And in fact, there's been already things like Israeli sports teams going to the Gulf. There was, before the current announcement, an Israeli team was going to go to the World Cup in Doha. The Emiratis invited Israel to have a booth at the World Expo 2020, now 2021 in Dubai, etc. All of these things were taking place before the signing ceremony today. So the reason that you could go from Ambassador Otaiba's op-ed in an Israeli newspaper to today very, very quickly over the summer is because there already was the architecture of relationships and trust, and now we can build from that. So today is a beginning, and what it means going forward it is on the Israeli people, on the Israeli government, on the Emirati and Bahraini governments who are already taking actions to prepare their people. And now both governments need to put the meat on the bones of what this agreement is, and the United States can encourage it as well. And in terms of Haley's question about the domestic politics, it strikes me that everything when it comes to President Trump is about domestic politics, and he's pretty open and explicit about that. Today and what today is, certainly there's a domestic political angle, and he's been clear the whole time, even moving forward with releasing his vision for peace, despite the warnings of so many that it wasn't going to produce a two-state outcome, and at worst could shift politics toward a one-state outcome, which would erode the Jewish and democratic identity of Israel. These are all things that the president has continued to move forward with, just because it's about a domestic, very cynical calculation that it'll appeal to a very narrow slice of his base. I'll leave it there because Dan covered so much.
Great, thank you. We'll start with you on this next one, Dina. How concerned should we be that the parties seem to have signed an agreement that they had only recently seen, or perhaps still had not fully seen, and that the agreements include unresolved issues? For example, the UAE and Israel don't seem to be in agreement regarding the sale of F-35s to the Emiratis. And for the Israelis, it's still unclear whether unilateral annexation is truly off the table forever or simply delayed. What do you make about the ambiguity of the details, or perhaps you might have some details to share?
I have no unique details to share, but I will say Dan and I both coming from a national security background, I think he and I would agree that process is really important and being deliberate about the negotiations. And certainly if I was advising a senior executive, I would encourage that person to be very clear about the specific wording and content of an agreement before you sign it. And I think the rush to today, the fact that we still don't have the text of these agreements, and there's already been some controversy about certain pieces of the agreement and what they may or may not mean, for example, for access to the holy places in Jerusalem, etc., shows that this is rush for domestic political timelines and not necessarily good policy that's in the US national security interest, in the Israeli security interest, or in the interest of sustainable agreements that will last beyond the current administration, which is ultimately what we all want. We want agreements where everyone understands what they agreed to and what the milestones and benchmarks and expectations are moving forward. That is how good diplomacy happens in this case. And it means that it can't just be between heads of state, it needs to be between their bureaucracies and their advisors so that everyone understands what is being agreed to and what the steps are to move forward. So in that case, or in that light, the F-35 is a great example. So the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, has made no secret for years that he desires the F-35. And this is an extremely advanced weapon. It will change the way future air wars are fought. It is the most expensive procurement program that the American Department of Defense has ever undertaken. And it is such sensitive defense technology that Israel currently is the only government or country in the Middle East that has been authorized to purchase and operate the F-35. And it's not that the UAE shouldn't be able to access or purchase that weapon system, but there's certainly many steps, both from a policy process and a legal requirement, that have not been checked off yet. One of those is the US legal and policy commitment to protect Israel's military superiority, otherwise known as qualitative military edge. There are both legal requirements that Congress has passed into law, as well as normally a very extensive technical conversation between experts in the Israeli government and the American government to make sure that Israel's military edge is protected as the US sells weapons to other countries in the region. And what's clear from the reactions across the Israeli government is that that legwork, that process work, had not been done inside Israel. And clearly from some of the bewilderment here in Washington, that legwork had also not been done here. So it's not too late, it could be done, but some very hard questions and some very technical questions need to be addressed, and they haven't yet. And to me, that's another example of the Trump administration prioritizing politics over good policy and process.
Dana, it was very thorough, so I'll only add a little bit more on the F-35 question. I mean, the description of the rushed process is absolutely correct. The UAE and Israel had only just a week or two ago had this inaugural visit. It was quite important that it happened, of Israeli tech experts and diplomats to Abu Dhabi to begin a process of negotiating all the technical aspects of a normalization agreement. What today's agreement, from what we know, again, since we haven't seen the text, is it's largely declaratory of an intention to finalize the rest of those technical details. And so there's goodwill and there's intention to do it. But in that sense, it was at a sort of a rushed quality, and the Bahraini one even more general than that one. But on the F-35, there's absolutely no question that this was essentially a quid pro quo. I was doing some Israeli press earlier today, and one of the commentators alongside me said, the Prime Minister has described this as peace for peace. But it's not really peace for peace. It's not as if nothing was given up. Israel has been, based on an agreement reached during the Obama administration, the only Air Force to fly the F-35 in the Middle East. The Obama administration turned down many UAE requests, even to receive briefings on that aircraft, much less to buy it. And so there's that concession. There's also the concession on annexation. So, there's no such thing as a free lunch in the world. But the technical discussions that normally precede a decision to do a major Arab sale in the Arab world, as Dana said, just haven't taken place. And I took part in those conversations. We have a very well developed system within the U.S. defense community and the Israeli defense community and the intelligence communities working together. We know how to do this. We know how to sit together and think through the very, very challenging questions of the specific capabilities that an Arab state will potentially purchase from the United States, about the specific quantities, about where those capabilities are based and located, about what additional armaments go along with the sale of a platform like an aircraft, about what precedent that sets for others in the region to purchase the same aircraft. It's one of the things that Israeli experts have raised is, generally speaking, when the UAE has bought a system from the United States, eventually Saudi Arabia also buys it. Well, the UAE is a friendly, stable country, very, very far from Israel, without a lot of refueling capacity. No one really expects those F-35s to be used against Israel. But Saudi Arabia and Egypt, another country that is also often in line for the same treatment as other Arab states, those are much closer, not necessarily as stable, not necessarily can reliably as friendly over a generation or two. Things can change in the Middle East. Most Israelis can tell you that Iran and Turkey were once their closest friends in the region. And Iran in 1979, very suddenly, and Turkey more gradually over the last 15 or 20 years of Erdogan's rule, have turned into enemies and adversaries. And so the idea that these systems would be provided without having thought through all of those contingencies is really not the way we do these things when they're done correctly. In 2011 or 12, the Obama administration did agree to a large sale of F-15s to Saudi Arabia and F-16s to the United Arab Emirates. And it took the better part of 2 years. I think it could have been even more than 2 years of very, very detailed, very technical discussions to understand all the implications of those sales and ensuring that what Israel had and needed and knew about all of those, the implications of those sales, would it preserve its qualitative military edge. And then when Congress was notified of the sale, which is another very important step in the process, and as often happens, turned to the Israelis and said, do you have any concerns? Israel said, our needs are taken care of. It is not clear. I think Dana's right. We can get there, but the sequence is completely backwards from the way it should be when this is done properly. I commend everybody to read an article that Dana published today with her colleague Barbara Lee from the Washington Institute on a website called War on the Rocks, which explains everything you want to know about this F-35 deal and why it's concerning about the way these processes have not been followed in the way they should have been.
Well, just to dig in on that point there, since you both have been at this a long time and seen such sales in Democratic and Republican administrations, because this process was circumvented, not even adhered to in any way, there is talk that the White House just plans to circumvent Congress and push forward with the sale. How odd would that be? What kind of threat would that pose to the region? And just in general, the fact that we haven't seen this agreement, have you ever seen anything like this before?
I'll just jump in. Dana knows this process better than I do, but it's true that earlier this year, maybe it was like last year, the administration bypassed the congressional notification process by declaring there was an emergency need to provide some sales specifically to the Saudis, which might not have been able to get through the congressional review process because there's a lot of bipartisan upset about the way Saudi Arabia has conducted the war in Yemen and been very disregarding civilian casualties. So they declared an emergency. There is a provision of law that permits that, but it's a sort of very questionable decision. If that were to be the path the administration chose in this case, it would be even stranger. If and when the UAE signs a deal for the F-35, it will take many years until they actually take possession of the first of those F-35s. Israel, under the agreement reached during the Obama-Biden administration, now has about half of the 50 that they've bought, and it takes a full decade to build and transfer those 50 aircraft. So to declare an emergency need for something that you aren't really going to deliver for years to come doesn't really make a lot of sense, and is certainly not in keeping with what the law, really the spirit of the law, and which is that Congress has a chance to have at least a review and have its say in doing so. I very much hope if they intend to do this, they'll go through that congressional review process. You know, I won't predict the outcome of that. Dana can explain a little bit more about, you know, what the likely paths that are. But I would also say that this is something that an incoming administration, if there's a new one, will have to review, and will have to study and have to see if it meets its tests of U.S. interests and U.S. values regarding Israel and its qualitative military edge, and regarding other things in the region, the war in Yemen, the war in Libya, other places the UAE has been active militarily. So I think there's a lot of questions that that still have to be answered.
I'll just add to what Dan said. So he is absolutely correct. There are different legal processes that any executive branch can choose when it wants to notify Congress of its intent to sell a weapons package to any country, not just Israel or countries in the Middle East. This is a global requirement for any country to which the United States wishes to sell a weapon. And one of those paths legally is to declare an emergency. But as Dan said, it would be absolutely unprecedented, specifically because nothing about the F-35 production timeline is an emergency. We're talking about multiple years. So it would be very, very hard and questionable and dubious for the administration to do such a thing. And the reality is that the administration doesn't really have to do that, because it's very unlikely that Congress would be able to block this sale anyway. And the reason is that the way Congress could block a weapons sale is that a resolution of disapproval, meaning an expression against moving forward with the sale, would have to pass in both the House of Representatives and the Senate by a 2/3 majority. And you need 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to override the prospect of a presidential veto, which in this case, the president most certainly would if it ever even got to his desk. And it's very unlikely to get to his desk because Republicans control the Senate and Democrats control the House of Representatives. So in a divided Congress, I see it as highly unlikely that both sides end up agreeing on a resolution to disapprove the F-35 sale to the UAE. So what this means is that the administration would go ahead and make the case to Congress for the national security interest in the United States that selling the F-35 makes sense in the context of the US-UAE relationship, and also that they've checked the box of meeting the legal requirements of protecting Israel's military edge, which is enshrined in US law. And the administration could do all those things. It just appears that they haven't gone through the preparatory steps yet to make that case sufficiently to Congress. And if there were to be a Biden administration, there's also precedent for new teams coming in and withdrawing these notifications of weapon sales and then re-notifying Congress of intent to sell later. So again, the step for gaining congressional approval is just one step, and there's a lot of contractual and technical negotiations that happen on the other side. So if there were to be a change in administration, it's very logical that the Biden administration would have different views and would want to have a different kind of discussion with Abu Dhabi, the capital of the UAE, about its intentions for using the F-35 and about some of its actions in other parts of the Middle East, absolutely unrelated to normalizing relations with Israel or to Israel's military edge. And Dan hit the nail on the head when he said that two areas of congressional concern that have been consistently raised in this current Congress and have not been addressed by the Trump administration are Emirati actions in Libya, and specifically its violation of the UN arms embargo, and work with Russia to supply a rival militia to the UN and US-backed or accepted government in Tripoli in Libya, and then also Emirati actions in Yemen that members of Congress believe have engaged in some torture, unauthorized transfer of US weapons to non-government groups in Yemen. And this is really important because we have to have trust that, given how important and groundbreaking the F-35 weapon system is, that the Emiratis are both capable and willing of protecting the sensitive defense technology on that weapon system. So there's, in short, a lot of questions to be answered, and none of these would suggest that this is an emergency situation. The only emergency is Donald Trump's political timeline of the November election coming up.
Thank you. Well, we're now going to move to audience questions, and I'm going to put some of them together that are thematically similar. Shayna from Arizona says, during the signing, rockets were fired from Gaza into southern Israel, reminding us that Israel's security problems are far from solved. What impact can the peace agreements have on Israel's security? Can the UAE or Bahrain have any influence over Hamas? Similarly, Alan Gross from DC says, what specific overtures do you think can be made to help Palestinian leadership decide to join a new process? And Avi asks, will a diplomatic Arab presence in Israel influence the Palestinians' behavior, and in particular serve as a catalyst for moving toward a peaceful negotiated agreement? And we'll start with you, Dan.
Of course, the rockets fired today from Gaza during the ceremony are, as they always are, completely unacceptable. They're the work of Hamas, a terrorist organization that rules Gaza, threatening Israel, but also ruling cruelly over the people who live in Gaza. And of course, Israel faces a range of security concerns, some in the north that have nothing really to do with the Palestinians, from Hezbollah and Syria, and of course, Iran, and its pursuit of a nuclear weapon and its antipathy for Israel. But there are security issues clearly associated with the unresolved Palestinian conflict, Hamas's presence in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where there has been fairly good security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But what this agreement, of course, is about is bilateral relations between Israel and these two Gulf states. It's, as I said, a good thing and very welcome. If others will join, that's also welcome. But if Israel were to normalize with every Arab state, and I hope that day will come as well, it would not fully resolve. It would not resolve actually necessarily at all some of these fundamental questions that are related to the Palestinian issue, the security questions, of course, but also Israel's Jewish and democratic character, which remains something that will be difficult to sustain, both of them, if Israel remains in total control of the West Bank, or certainly if the Palestinian Authority doesn't continue to function in the way it has over the years. Annexation put all of that at grave risk. And obviously that threat has been removed from the table, certainly for I think a number of years, which is a very positive thing. But what I hope we will see, and what I think a Biden administration would certainly do, is try to use these agreements and these new relationships, or these newly formalized and official relationships, as a basis upon which to not only expand the circle of peace to include other Arab states, but a basis upon which to generate some new momentum on the Israeli-Palestinian track back toward a realistic version of a two-state solution. That's not the Trump plan. The Trump plan was not a two-state solution. It was negotiated with one side, not with two sides, and obviously by definition, that's not a way to mediate a conflict. And it really didn't describe a Palestinian state that any Palestinian leader could ever defend to their people. It was more isolated islands of limited Palestinian autonomy, surrounded by annexed areas of the West Bank. So it needs to be steering back toward eventual negotiations toward a real two-state solution. That's not going to happen immediately. I think we all know that the current Palestinian leadership is not likely to be the leadership that is going to be able to take those steps. They've made many mistakes. They've stayed away from negotiations. They've paid salaries to terrorists in prison. They've walked out of negotiations. There's total mistrust between the current Israeli and Palestinian leaders. But there will be a transition, certainly on the Palestinian leadership that's coming. Arguably, it will come on the Israeli side eventually. And of course, if there's a new American administration, I think it opens up possibilities for these Arab states who are now normalizing their relations with Israel to be actually more influential with Israel, with the Israeli people and the Israeli public, when they're in open dialogue with them than they ever could have been as boycotting nations. Egypt and Jordan, after all, even without warm people-to-people relations, have been much more engaged on Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy than any other Arab state. And because of their resources, in the case of the UAE, they could be able to reinforce the economic and institution-building process that needs to be undertaken to help Palestinians prepare for statehood, and perhaps also put some positive pressure on Palestinians to change some of their approaches and adopt realistic positions. I think there's a real opportunity here. I wrote about it in the Washington Post this week with Dana's colleague, David Makovsky, that this can be a basis for generating new momentum toward two states, but it has to be understood what a real two-state solution looks like, and that needs to be laid out very clearly in a way President Trump did not do in his plan in January, and nothing about the current agreements does do either.
I'll just add, for those of you who may have tuned in to the actual White House signing ceremony today, if you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu's remarks, the word Palestinians did not come up once. And if you listen to the Foreign Minister of the UAE, Abdullah bin Zayed, His Highness, he mentioned it multiple times, and he also spoke in Arabic. And to me, what he is signaling is to the people of the region, to Emirati people, and to Palestinians who may have been tuning in today, that this is not us turning away from the Palestinian issue. In fact, there's direct linkage between Israel committing to stop annexation and the Emirati agreement to normalize with Israel at this time, given that it was already benefiting from extensive relationships with Israel under the table. So coming into the daylight and normalizing relations is now explicitly tied to Israel not continuing with annexation in the West Bank, which preserves the possibility for a two-state solution. And going forward, I encourage you all to read Dan's piece with David Makovsky if you haven't yet. And this is very much up to those capitals, to Abu Dhabi and Manama and others who may be considering getting on the normalization train, making the Palestinian issue, making improving conditions in the West Bank, leaning on Palestinian leaderships with appropriate incentives to change behavior, be more cooperative in terms of coming to the table for negotiations, and signaling to Palestinian people, especially youth who want jobs, who want social engagements, who want to live beyond the West Bank and be integrated into the region, to lay down both policies and programs and assistance packages that can shape the environment for when leaders are ready to sit down at the table. So this is very much in the hands of these two governments as they move down the schedule of normalizing steps that they both agreed to take. So first, it's supposed to be expansion of economic ties, then more in the security sectors, and then setting up reciprocal embassies in each country's capital. And as these things take place, there are more and more opportunities to raise both privately, diplomatically, and publicly ways in which the two-state solution can be protected, and that both the Israeli government and Palestinians can take steps toward that outcome.
Great. We'll now focus on the implications for domestic politics here and in Israel. Sam from Maryland has asked, there are large protests against Prime Minister Netanyahu going on now in Israel, some focusing on the investigations into alleged corruption and others around his handling of coronavirus. As we know, Israel is headed into a multi-week lockdown. How do these agreements impact Prime Minister Netanyahu's political situation at home? And then similarly, in terms of our own domestic politics, what do we make of the fact that while Netanyahu is here in Washington, he will not be meeting with Joe Biden just less than 50 days before an election? Dan, we'll start with you.
Well, I try to stay out of his domestic Israeli politics. It's certainly not what I remained in Israel to work on. But you're correct, of course. There have been a lot of protests against the prime minister in recent weeks over the corruption trial, and more recently over the coronavirus resurgence. It's really now reaching new heights, and there's going to be a new 3-week lockdown coming up over the Jewish holidays. As a result of that, and the economic crisis that goes with it. So he is under some pressure. The fact, as he was driving to the airport to fly to Washington the night before last, some of the protesters blocked the road on the way to the airport, trying to make the point that it's all very well to go to Washington and sign agreements. I'm sure most of them will support the agreement. But we have some very important business to attend to at home, and they were trying to make that point. Look, the country's been very divided. It was through 3 inconclusive elections. He managed to remain prime minister, but with the probably less than 50% support, but more than anybody else support that implied. And I think this, in some ways, these agreements don't change very much. Again, very much welcomed across the board. Some serious questions about the management of the security aspect of it, the qualitative military edge aspect of it with the F-35, the proper preparation for it. But overall, most Israelis I know are planning their getaway vacation to Dubai after the coronavirus travel restrictions end. And so, people are happy about it. But I don't think it really addresses most of the issues that the people who are protesting, and those issues will continue to play out. On our side, as Dana alluded to earlier in the conversation, we know that President Trump has tried to instrumentalize Israel for partisan political gain from the beginning. He has done some things that many Israelis care about, but he has said openly that his target in so doing is evangelical voters. He's done so with the crudest possible insulting comments about American Jews who vote for Democratic candidates who are disloyal, really kind of an anti-Semitic idea that we should be loyal to Israel more than America, or an absurd non-democratic idea that we should be loyal to him despite all of the things we disagree with him on. So he has said that. He's also made outrageous statements about the Democratic Party, that it's an anti-Semitic party, it's an anti-Israel party. These are absurd characterizations. And that's because he believes that if he does something that is positive for Israel, we owe him. We owe him our votes. We owe him our loyalty. We essentially are his subjects to thank him and praise him for whatever it is he's done. Well, that's not how our democracy works. And I don't think it will have that impact. I don't know what if there would be any contact between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Vice President Biden. Obviously, the Vice President's not in Washington. I do know that in a particularly classless, but typically classless move, while the Prime Minister today was sitting in the Oval Office with President Trump and taking questions from reporters, President Trump made insulting comments about Sleepy Joe and so forth. Here we are in what is a moment of should be bipartisan consensus. There were Democratic members of Congress who went to the White House today to celebrate the signing. And rather than treat it as a moment of serious national security interests being advanced through the support of an ally that has always been a source of bipartisan consensus, he took insulting partisans pot shots at Vice President Biden in Netanyahu's presence, essentially exposing Netanyahu into that. So that's typical of the president's conduct. But as I think you indicated in your poll results earlier, and I think we both agree, American Jews know which of these two candidates is consistent with our values and will conduct himself the way we believe a president should, including giving Israel all the backing it needs and treating us as American citizens with the respect we deserve.
Dana.
Thank you. So I should clarify up front that I don't speak for the Biden campaign, but I will say I'm not surprised to hear that the Vice President is not meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu during his visit to the United States. And the reason is that after President Trump won, but before he was inaugurated, there's a well-established record of contacts between Trump campaign officials and foreign government representatives before the Trump administration was inaugurated and went into the White House. And those are at best inappropriate and at worst violations or illegal based on what US law is. And so my interpretation of this is the Biden administration is being exceptionally diligent about making it clear that regardless of the campaign, there's only one administration at the time, and they will not do anything that is perceived as meddling or undermining the current administration, despite the fact that on many issues, there's disagreement. So that is how I would interpret this. And I'll just say, in terms of domestic outlook on Israel, I don't think we should underestimate the psychological impact for Israelis of these normalization agreements. The fact that at some point after the COVID pandemic, Israelis will be able to go to Dubai they'll be able to go to Bahrain, that tech sectors, ag sectors, entrepreneurs will be able to interact. The impact of one day not being able to make a call to Abu Dhabi or Dubai or any of the other 5 Emirates, and all of a sudden the next day you can, to see El Al with its symbol fly and land in Abu Dhabi and be able to overfly Saudi airspace. I think these are incredibly important things. But on the very real security challenges facing Israel, whether it's Hezbollah and its rapidly expanding missile arsenal on Israel's northern front, whether it's Iranian activities and Hezbollah in Syria moving closer and staging attacks on Israel in the Golan Heights, whether it's ISIS and those activities in the Sinai to Israel's south, whether it's Hamas sending explosive balloons, all of these issues are day-to-day realities for Israel. And nothing about Trump administration policies for the past 3.5 years, and nothing about these normalization agreements addresses the very near-term, real, immediate security threats that make Israelis feel insecure and that they want addressed. And so on the very real issues, strategically, existentially, that your average Israeli lives with on a daily basis, the Trump administration has not articulated or implemented policies to address those very real, very near-term threats right on Israel's borders.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, for sharing your insights on this very important and interesting day. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in to our call this afternoon. We are 48 days away from the most important election of our lifetime. And for some of you with early voting and mail-in ballots, it's already begun. We have several opportunities for you to join JDCA as we near this election. Tonight and tomorrow we'll convene our weekly phone banks around the country to mobilize Jewish voters. And from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. every Tuesday and Wednesday and Sunday, except for Jewish holidays, between now and the election. We have opportunities for you to join us almost every day. If you go to jewishdems.org/events, join us. We are organizing virtually to impact this election, and we are doing everything we can, and we encourage you to join us. Finally, we want to wish you all a Shana Tova. May 5781 bring us health, security, peace, and a new president. And thank you to Ambassador Shapiro and Dana again for joining us. Thanks to all of you. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana Tova.